The old man's hands trembled as he turned the yellowed pages. In a dimly lit archive beneath the streets of Paris, Dr. Alexander Mercier had spent the last 40 years of his life studying something most dismissed as fantasy: the cryptic verses of Michel de Nostradamus, better known as Nostradamus. But tonight, as the clock struck midnight on December 31, 2024, Alexander wasn't reading ancient history. He was reading tomorrow's headlines. "My God," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold underground chamber. "It's all here. Every single word. Let me take you back to understand how we arrived at this moment. A moment that would change everything we thought we knew about power, prophecy, and the fate of nations." 3 months earlier, in October 2024, something unprecedented happened in the city of Kazan, Russia. Leaders from Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa gathered not for a routine diplomatic meeting, but for something far more significant. They were joined by representatives from over 30 other nations, all seeking to reshape the global order that had dominated since World War II. The Western media barely covered it. The American public hardly noticed. But Alexander Mercier noticed. Because 500 years ago, Nostradamus had written about this exact moment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the prophecies, 10 verses that speak of collapse, transformation, and a new world order emerging from the East. 10 prophecies that, according to Alexander's research, point directly to 2025. 10 warnings that America may have ignored for far too long. Are you ready to hear them? Because once you do, you'll never see the world the same way again. The first prophecy: the eagle loses its talons. Century 2, Quatrain 89. Alexander had memorized it years ago, but only now did its meaning crystallize with terrifying clarity. One day the two great leaders will be friends. Their great power will be seen to grow. The new land will be at the height of its power. To the man of blood the number is reported. Sarah Chin sat in her small apartment in Detroit, staring at her bank statement. 3 jobs. 3 jobs, and she still couldn't afford her mother's medication. The factory where her father had worked for 30 years had closed down 5 years ago. Moved to Mexico, then to China, then to Vietnam, chasing ever cheaper labor. The American dream, her parents had called it. But what dream was this? Across the Pacific, in the sprawling manufacturing hub of Shenzhen, Wei Zhang watched the sunrise over a city that hadn't existed 50 years ago. His grandfather had been a farmer. His father had worked in the first factories. Now Wei was an engineer at a company developing quantum computers that would soon make American technology look like ancient relics. He didn't hate America. He simply didn't think about it much anymore. This is what the first prophecy speaks of: not a sudden collapse, but a gradual transfer of power so subtle that most people don't notice until it's already happened. The two great leaders Nostradamus referenced weren't individuals but nations. China and Russia, finding common cause not out of love but out of necessity. The new land at the height of its power? That was America in the 20th century. But the verse ends with something ominous. To the man of blood the number is reported. What number? Alexander believed it was a tally, a counting of debts, both moral and financial, that would soon come due. The United States national debt had surpassed $36 trillion. Most Americans couldn't even conceptualize such a number. But China could. Russia could. And they were counting. The second prophecy: the Golden Bridge collapses. Century I, Quatrain 53. Alas, we will see a great nation troubled, and the holy law in utter ruin, Christianity governed throughout by other laws, when a new source of gold and silver is discovered. In a small office in Mumbai, Rajesh Patel was making history without anyone in the West noticing. As a financial technology specialist, he was helping to develop something that would terrify Wall Street executives if they truly understood its implications. A unified digital payment system for Brics nations that completely bypassed the US dollar. For decades, the dollar had been the world's reserve currency. It was the golden bridge upon which all international trade traveled. If you wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, you paid in dollars. If you wanted to purchase manufactured goods from Taiwan, you paid in dollars. This gave America an incredible power, the ability to print money that the entire world needed. But what happens when the world doesn't need it anymore? Maria Santos, a teacher in Sao Paulo, Brazil, had watched her country suffer through years of economic instability, partially due to U.S. Federal Reserve policies that prioritized American interests. When Brazil announced it would begin trading with China using yuan and reais instead of dollars, Maria felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her students would inherit a more just world. The new source of gold and silver Nostradamus wrote about wasn't literal precious metals. It was a new financial system, one that didn't route through New York or London. Alexander had calculated the dates. The new Brics currency was scheduled to launch in phases throughout 2025. Each phase would pull more trade away from the dollar. Each phase would weaken America's golden bridge until one day, it would collapse entirely. But here's what terrified Alexander most. Nostradamus suggested this collapse wouldn't be peaceful. The verse speaks of utter ruin and laws being governed by other powers. Was this a prediction of civil unrest? Of America turning inward toward authoritarianism as economic power slipped away? History had seen this pattern before. Empires don't surrender power gracefully. The third prophecy, the Merchant King's Fall. Century 8, Quatrain 28. The copies of gold and silver inflated, which after the theft were thrown into the lake. At the discovery that all is exhausted and dissipated by the debt, all scripts and bonds will be wiped out. In a glass tower in Manhattan, James Mitchell stared at screens showing global markets in real time. As CEO of one of America's largest investment firms, he had always believed in the permanence of the system. Markets rose and fell, but the structure remained. Yet lately something felt different. Capital was flowing in unexpected directions. Investors from the Middle East were diversifying away from dollar-denominated assets. Sovereign wealth funds were purchasing gold at unprecedented rates. It's just a hedge, his colleagues assured him. They'll come back. But James wasn't so sure. He had read history. He knew what happened to previous reserve currencies. The Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, the British pound. Each had seemed permanent until suddenly it wasn't. The third prophecy speaks directly to this moment. The inflation of currency, copies of gold and silver inflated, the theft by those in power, and ultimately, a revelation that the entire system is built on debt that can never be repaid. When that realization spreads, Nostradamus warns, all scripts and bonds will be wiped out. Think about that for a moment. What does that mean in practical terms? It means the retirement funds that Americans have spent their lives building could evaporate. It means the treasury bonds that nations hold as safe reserves could become worthless paper. It means the financial architecture that has supported 75 years of relative stability could crumble in months, weeks, or even days. Alexander had found historical records suggesting Nostradamus himself had survived a period of currency collapse in 16th century France. He had seen merchants who were wealthy on Monday begging for bread on Friday. The seer understood how quickly confidence could evaporate and how devastating the consequences could be. In 2025, Alexander believed America would learn this lesson the hard way. The fourth prophecy, the Eastern Dawn. Century 2, Quatrain 29. The Eastern man will leave his seat to pass the Apennine Mountains to see Gaul. He will transpire the sky, the waters, and the snow, and everyone will be struck with his rod. Li Wei had never been to America, but America had shaped his entire life. His father had worked in a factory making shoes for Nike. His mother had assembled iPhones. Li himself now designed artificial intelligence systems that would soon run everything from hospitals to transportation networks. But unlike his parents, Li didn't see America as some distant, superior civilization. He saw it as an equal. Soon, perhaps, as a memory. The fourth prophecy describes the rise of Eastern power, not through conquest but through expansion, innovation, and influence. The Eastern man leaving his seat represents China's Belt and Road Initiative, which had connected Asia to Europe through a vast network of infrastructure projects. The Apennines are mountains in Italy. Nostradamus was describing Chinese influence reaching into the heart of Europe, historically America's closest ally. And it was happening. Italy had signed onto Belt and Road. So had Greece. So had Portugal. Hungary was deepening ties with Beijing. America was losing Europe, and most Americans didn't even know it. But the verse ends with something even more significant. Everyone will be struck with his rod. A rod is a symbol of authority, of governance. Nostradamus was predicting that Eastern powers would set the rules, would determine the standards, would become the authority that others followed. In 2025, Alexander calculated, this shift would become undeniable. China would surpass the United States in several key technological domains: quantum computing, renewable energy, artificial intelligence. The Belt and Road would be complete, creating an economic sphere that excluded America. And the rod would fall, not with violence, but with the simple reality that the East had learned, innovated, and outpaced the West. Jennifer Morrison, a programmer in Silicon Valley, was already seeing the signs. The best students at Stanford were from China and India. The most innovative startups were launching in Shenzhen and Bangalore. The next generation of technology wasn't being invented in California, It was being invented elsewhere by people who were younger, hungrier, and unburdened by the complacency that success breeds. "We're being left behind," she told her colleagues. They laughed. "Americans don't get left behind," they said. "We're America." But Nostradamus had seen empires fall before. He knew the pattern. First denial, then anger, then desperate scrambling, and finally acceptance of a new reality. The fifth prophecy, the Alliance of Shadows. Century v. Quatrain 78. The two will not remain allied for long. Within 13 years they give in to barbarian power. There will be such a loss on both sides, that one will bless the bark and its cape. This was perhaps the most troubling prophecy Alexander had found. It spoke of an alliance, clearly referencing the growing cooperation between Brics nations, but predicted this alliance wouldn't last. There would be internal conflicts, power struggles, perhaps even war between the new powers. But before that collapse, the prophecy warned, the alliance would inflict tremendous damage on its opponents. Such a loss on both sides suggested a conflict that would leave everyone wounded. And the final line, "One will bless the bark and its cape," Alexander interpreted as a reference to the Catholic Church, or more broadly, to traditional Western institutions that would be seen as sources of stability amid chaos. In a military strategy room in Washington, D.C., General Marcus Thompson was conducting war games that kept him awake at night. The scenarios were classified, but the general outline was clear. If conflict erupted between the United States and a coalition of Brics nations, there would be no winners. The economic interdependence was too deep. The military technologies too destructive. The consequences too far-reaching. "We need to avoid this," Marcus told his superiors. "We need diplomacy, engagement, compromise. But compromise requires acknowledging that other perspectives might have validity. It requires accepting that American interests aren't the only interests that matter." And in 2024, as Marcus looked at the political landscape, he wasn't sure America was capable of that kind of humility. Fatima Hassan, a diplomat from Saudi Arabia, sat in similar meetings and reached similar conclusions. The Middle East was being courted by both sides. America offering military protection and investment, Brics offering energy partnerships and infrastructure development. Her country would have to choose, and that choice would have consequences that would echo for generations. The fifth prophecy suggested that 2025 would be the year these tensions reached a breaking point. Not necessarily war, Nostradamus often spoke in metaphors, but a moment of crisis that would force every nation to declare where they stood. And in that moment, Alexander feared, America would discover just how many countries had quietly chosen the other side. The sixth prophecy, the flood of peoples. Century 2, Quatrain 62. Mabus will soon die, then will come a horrible destruction of people and animals. At once vengeance will be revealed. 100, hand, thirst, hunger, when the comet will run. This quatrain had troubled Nostradamus scholars for centuries. Who or what was Mabus? Some believed it was an anagram, others thought it was a code. Alexander had a different interpretation. Mabus represented the current world order, the post-World War II system built on American hegemony, international institutions, and global trade rules that benefited the West. When Mabus dies, Nostradamus warns, there will be a horrible destruction of people and animals. Alexander didn't interpret this as literal apocalypse, but as the chaos that emerges when the structures that maintain order collapse. When currencies fail, when trade routes are disrupted, when alliances fracture, people suffer. Refugees flee. Resources become scarce. Violence erupts. The verse mentions thirst, hunger, suggesting resource scarcity. In 2025, Alexander calculated, the world would face multiple converging crises. Climate change affecting agriculture, water resources becoming flashpoints for conflict, and the breakdown of international cooperation making these problems harder to solve. Carlos Mendoza stood at the border between Guatemala and Mexico, part of a caravan of thousands seeking a better life. He had left his village because the rains had stopped coming, because the crops had failed, because there was no future there anymore. He knew that America was building walls, both literal and bureaucratic. He knew he wasn't welcome. But what choice did he have? Multiply Carlos by millions. Multiply his story across Africa, South Asia, Central America, and the Middle East. That's what Nostradamus foresaw. Not an invasion, but a flood of desperate humanity driven by circumstances beyond their control, seeking refuge in nations that were increasingly turning inward and hostile. The final line, when the comet will run, had multiple interpretations. Some thought it was literal, predicting an astronomical event in 2025. Alexander believed it was metaphorical, representing a crisis that arrives suddenly and cannot be ignored. When that comet runs, when that crisis hits, the sixth prophecy suggests America will face a choice: open its doors and share its wealth, or close its borders and face the moral consequences. History judges empires not by how they treat their friends, but by how they treat the desperate strangers at their gates. The seventh prophecy, the false king. Century 3, Quatrain 41. Hunchback will be elected by the council, a more hideous monster not seen on earth. The willing shot will put out his eye. The traitor to the king received as faithful. Alexander's hands always shook when he read this prophecy. It spoke of leadership, specifically, of terrible leadership emerging during times of crisis. The hunchback wasn't literally deformed, but represented someone twisted by ambition, someone willing to betray principles for power. In America, the year 2025 would bring political turbulence. The 2024 elections had deepened divisions rather than healing them. Trust in institutions was at historic lows. Into this vacuum, Nostradamus warned, would step leaders who promised simple solutions to complex problems, who blamed outsiders for internal failures, who offered strength but delivered corruption. The traitor to the king received as faithful. This line haunted Alexander. It suggested that those who betrayed American values would be celebrated as patriots. Those who questioned them would be attacked as traitors. The inversion would be complete. Marcus Washington, a journalist in Philadelphia, saw this dynamic playing out in real time. When he wrote articles questioning economic policies that benefited the wealthy while workers struggled, he received death threats. When he investigated corruption, he was accused of being unpatriotic. The truth had become partisan. "We're eating ourselves alive," he told his editor, "and nobody seems to care." The seventh prophecy predicted this internal decay would accelerate in 2025. As external pressures mounted, economic challenges from Brics, diplomatic isolation, resource constraints, America would turn inward, searching for scapegoats, embracing authoritarianism disguised as strength. But Nostradamus also included a note of hope. The willing shot will put out his eye. Alexander interpreted this as resistance. People who would see through the lies, who would refuse to follow false leaders, who would preserve truth even when it became dangerous. The question was, would there be enough of them? Would they act soon enough? Or would America spiral into a darkness from which it might never emerge? The eighth prophecy, the three brothers. Century 8, Quatrain 17. Those at ease will suddenly be cast down. The world put into trouble by three brothers. Their enemies will seize the marine city. Hunger, fire, blood, plague, all evils doubled. This prophecy had always been ambiguous, but Alexander believed he had finally decoded it. The three brothers weren't individuals. They were the three pillars of the New World Order emerging from the East: China's manufacturing and technological dominance, Russia's resource wealth and military power, and India's demographic advantage and growing innovation sector. Together, these three would put the world into trouble, not necessarily through malice, but simply by disrupting the comfortable arrangements that had benefited the West for so long. Those at ease will suddenly be cast down, referred to Americans and Europeans who had lived their entire lives assuming prosperity was their birthright. Thomas Baker had been a banker in London for 25 years. He had a comfortable salary, a nice home in the suburbs, private schools for his children. In early 2025, his firm announced massive layoffs. The restructuring, they called it. The reality was simpler. The center of global finance was shifting. Singapore was growing. Shanghai was growing. Mumbai was growing. London was becoming less relevant, and Thomas's expertise was becoming less valuable. How did this happen? He asked his wife. They had done everything right: good education, hard work, playing by the rules. But the rules had changed without anyone telling them. The prophecy's final line was darkest: hunger, fire, blood, plague, all evils doubled. Alexander hoped this was metaphorical: economic hunger, political fire, rhetorical blood, psychological plague. But even metaphorically, it painted a grim picture of 2025. Multiple crises compounding each other, each making the others worse, creating a perfect storm that would test every institution and every individual. Their enemies will seize the marine city. Alexander believed this referred to control of shipping lanes and ports. The Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the South China Sea. These maritime choke points controlled global trade. In 2025, Nostradamus suggested, control would pass to new hands. And America, for all its military power, wouldn't be able to stop it. The ninth prophecy, the Great Reckoning. Century I, Quatrain 67. The great famine which I sense approaching will often turn up, then become universal, so great and long that they will come to pull roots from the trees and child from the breast. This was the prophecy that made Alexander weep. It spoke of suffering so profound that humanity itself would be tested. Not just economic collapse, not just political upheaval, but genuine humanitarian crisis. Dr. Amara Okonkwo stood in a clinic in Lagos, Nigeria, and watched children waste away from malnutrition. The global food system was breaking down. Climate change was disrupting harvests. International cooperation was failing. And the poorest, as always, suffered first. But the ninth prophecy suggested this suffering wouldn't remain localized. It would become universal. Even wealthy nations would feel it. Even America would face scarcity. Alexander traced the logic. As Brics nations prioritized trade among themselves, supply chains that had fed American consumers would break down. As the dollar weakened, import prices would soar. As political instability grew, agricultural production would falter. And as these crises compounded, the Great Famine would arrive. Not necessarily the absence of food, but the inability of systems to distribute it fairly. They will come to pull roots from the trees, a metaphor for desperate measures. Policies that would have been unthinkable in stable times. Rationing, nationalization, perhaps even violence over resources. And child from the breast, the most heartbreaking line. Families torn apart by economic necessity. Parents unable to feed their children. The most fundamental human bonds strained to breaking. In 2025, Alexander feared, Americans would discover they weren't immune to these ancient patterns of collapse. They would learn that prosperity was never guaranteed, that civilization was more fragile than they imagined, that the distance between comfort and desperation was shorter than they thought. But perhaps he hoped this recognition would also breed humility. Perhaps experiencing vulnerability would teach empathy. Perhaps the Great Reckoning would force America to rejoin the human community, rather than standing apart and above it. The 10th prophecy, the Phoenix. Century 2, Quatrain 46. After great human misery, a greater one approaches. The great cycle of the centuries renewed. It will rain blood, milk, famine, war and disease. In the sky will be seen a fire, dragging a tail of sparks. The final prophecy was the most ambiguous but also the most hopeful. Yes, it spoke of tremendous suffering, blood, milk, famine, war and disease. Yes, it suggested 2025 would be darker before any dawn arrived. But it also spoke of renewal, the great cycle of the centuries renewed. Alexander understood history as cyclical. Empires rose and fell. Systems emerged and collapsed. Power shifted from one region to another, then back again. This was natural, even healthy. Stagnation was death. Change was life. The fire in the sky, dragging a tail of sparks, could be literal. A comet, an asteroid, some celestial event that would occur in 2025. But Alexander preferred the metaphorical reading. A dramatic transformation that would illuminate the darkness, that would cauterize wounds, that would burn away the old and make space for the new. In Sao Paulo, Maria Santos taught her students about history's great transitions. The fall of Rome hadn't been the end of civilization. It had been the beginning of the medieval world, which had eventually birthed the Renaissance. The collapse of feudalism had been traumatic, but it had created space for democracy. The end of colonialism had been violent, but it had given birth to new nations and new possibilities. Change is painful, she told her class. But it's also necessary. Nothing lasts forever. Not empires, not systems, not even great nations. One of her students raised a hand. So America will fall? Maria paused. America will change. The question is whether Americans can accept that change, can adapt to it, can find a new role in a world that's no longer centered on them. This was the ultimate message of the 10th prophecy, Alexander believed. 2025 would bring a reckoning, yes. It would bring suffering, yes. But it would also bring opportunity, the chance to build something better, something more just, something more sustainable. The phoenix must burn before it can rise from the ashes. Back in the Paris archive, as 2025 dawned, Alexander Mercier carefully closed the ancient book. He had spent 40 years studying these prophecies, but only now did they feel urgent, immediate, real. He thought about Sarah Chin in Detroit struggling to survive. He thought about Wei Zhang in Shenzhen building the future. He thought about Rajesh Patel in Mumbai reshaping finance. He thought about all the people in all the nations whose lives would be transformed by the great changes coming. Nostradamus hadn't been a fortune teller. He had been an observer of patterns, a student of history, A man who understood that the same dynamics that had toppled previous empires would topple future ones as well. The specifics changed, the technologies, the names, the dates. But the underlying forces remained constant. Hubris, greed, the refusal to adapt, the assumption that power was permanent. Alexander powered up his laptop and began to write. His document would be published online, would be read by thousands, would be dismissed by most as conspiracy theory or doomsaying. But some would listen. Some would understand. Some would prepare. He wrote about the 10 prophecies. He wrote about 2025. He wrote about the choices that still remained available, if only people would make them. He wrote about the possibility of learning from history rather than repeating it. He wrote about the chance, however slim, that humanity might choose cooperation over conflict, humility over arrogance, adaptation over rigidity. He wrote until dawn broke over Paris, illuminating the old city that had survived so many transformations, so many cycles of death and rebirth. And as he wrote, in living rooms and offices and classrooms around the world, people were waking up to the first day of 2025, unaware that the year ahead would challenge everything they believed about power, about prosperity, about their place in the world. The prophecies were set. The year had begun. The only question remaining was whether humanity would rise to meet this moment with wisdom and courage, or whether it would stumble into darkness, repeating the mistakes of every failed empire that had come before. 3 months later, in March 2025, the first cracks appeared. The Brics payment system launched successfully, and within weeks, over 40 nations had signed on. Trade flows shifted dramatically. The dollar's value began a slow, then accelerating decline. Stock markets around the world gyrated wildly as investors tried to price in a new reality. In Washington, D.C., emergency meetings were held. In New York, banks convened crisis committees. In living rooms across America, people watched their retirement accounts shrink and wondered what was happening. The prophecies were coming true. Sarah Chun lost her third job when the retail chain she worked for declared bankruptcy, unable to compete with cheaper imports that were no longer denominated in dollars. Wei Zhang's company signed a massive government contract to develop quantum infrastructure that would give China technological supremacy in critical domains. Rajesh Patel was promoted to director of the new Brics financial institution, headquartered in Mumbai. General Marcus Thompson watched war game scenarios evolve from theoretical to plausible to probable. Jennifer Morrison saw her Silicon Valley company lose its best engineers to opportunities in Asia. Carlos Mendoza reached the American border and was turned back by soldiers, part of a military deployment to control migration that had swelled to unprecedented levels. Marcus Washington wrote articles documenting all of this, trying to help his readers understand the magnitude of the transformation. Most didn't want to hear it. They wanted reassurance, simple answers, someone to blame. The false leaders rose, offering exactly that. The internal divisions deepened. The cycle that Nostradamus had foreseen accelerated. By June 2025, food prices had doubled. By August, protests had erupted in major American cities. By October, the midterm elections were consumed by chaos and recrimination. By December, when Alexander Mercier checked back on his prophecies, every single one had manifested in some form. Not exactly as he had interpreted them. Reality is always messier than prediction. But the broad strokes were there: the decline of American power, the rise of Eastern influence, the emergence of a new financial system, the internal political decay, the human suffering, and yes, even glimpses of renewal, of people coming together in community, of new ideas emerging from the rubble of failed systems. The great cycle was turning. I want you to think about something. Right now, as you hear these words, history is being made. The future that Nostradamus glimpsed 5 centuries ago is unfolding around us. The question isn't whether change is coming, it's already here. The question is what we choose to do about it. Do we cling to the past, denying reality until it overwhelms us? Do we lash out in fear, seeking scapegoats and simple solutions? Do we retreat into tribalism, abandoning the ideals that made us great? Or do we adapt? Do we learn? Do we embrace humility? Do we recognize that a world where power is more evenly distributed might actually be more just, even if it's less comfortable for those of us who benefited from the old arrangement? Sarah Chun eventually found work with a community organization helping people navigate the new economic reality. Wei Zhang used his success to fund scholarships for students from poor backgrounds. Rajesh Patel insisted the new financial system include protections for developing nations. General Marcus Thompson advocated for diplomacy even as he prepared for worst-case scenarios. Jennifer Morrison started mentoring young programmers, passing on her knowledge. Carlos Mendoza found refuge in a church network that valued compassion over nationality. Marcus Washington kept writing truth, even when it was dangerous.